So in this video, we'll be picking up where we left off in Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco. And that would be on chapter 18. And I know that we have a gift coming up on page 191. Let's see what we get there today. Yes, we will. So, I will pull that out when we get there. Now, 191 falls in chapter 19, like a few pages in. So I think what we'll do is after I read page 119, I'll go ahead and open the gift and then keep reading to the end of that chapter for this video. So I hope everybody is getting excited for the holidays. I know that I am. That's why I'm in my little shirt. Been in this shirt for the last couple of videos. Yeah, let me know how excited you guys are in the comments below. Alright, but without further ado, reading by Ree, Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco, Chapter 18. Okay, and before that there is a picture at the start of this chapter. I don't know if you can see it. Of Necropolis, which London Necropolis Railway, 19th century. Okay. Chapter 18, Necropolis Railway. Thomas Cresswell's flat, Piccadilly Street, 25 September 1888. I stood half a block away, hiding, as Thomas opened the door to his flat, then peered around, looking as sharply put together as if it were 9 in the morning instead of nearly 10 at night. I wondered if he ever looked unkempt or frazzled. Perhaps his hair was permanently plastered to the side of his head for less hassle. My brother ought to take a lesson. I watched silently, gathering courage to walk over to him, but some innate force whispered for me to remain hidden. I half expected him to come marching over, but he didn't notice me standing half in the shadows several yards away. I had lied and told Blackburn that Thomas lived 2 blocks down, and had been slowly making my way toward the correct address. I wasn't sure what I was doing here so late at night, and was collecting my thoughts. Silly fears had bubbled up. What if the girls at tea were wrong, and he did live with his family? They'd be scandalized by my unchaperoned presence at this hour. It's not as though he'd offered me his address. I'd found it in one of Uncle's ledgers, and was contemplating simply going home. Now I was hesitating because he was acting suspiciously. I held my breath, certain Thomas had somehow spotted me or deduced my arrival, but his attention never touched on my location. He flipped the collar of his overcoat up, then strode down the gaslit street, his footsteps purposefully quiet. What are you off to? Where are you off to? I whispered. Fog hovered in steamy puffs, obscuring everything from the ground up. All too quickly I lost sight of him. Cool fingers of fear slid down my spine, coaxing gooseflesh to rise. Though it was a fashionable neighborhood during the daytime, I didn't want to be stuck alone when everyone shuttered up for the evening. Gripping my skirts, I scurried after Thomas, carefully sticking to shadows between the lamps. A minute later, I caught up with him near the end of the block. He'd stopped and was looking one way, then the next. My heart crashed into my ribs, and I prayed he wouldn't turn around. Quickly stepping back into the fog, I let its icy wall envelop me. Thomas cocked his head but continued down the next road, resuming his silent yet fast pace. Exhaling, I counted 3 breaths, then followed, taking more cautious steps. We traveled through deserted streets, meeting only one horse-drawn cart returning from the park. The scent of manure followed in its wake, and I fought the urge to sneeze, lest I give myself away. Thomas didn't halt again, his long legs carrying him in great strides toward Westminster Bridge Road and the River Thames. In the distance I made out the stone archway of the London Necropolis railway station. The station had been built 30 years ago to help ferry the dead from London to Surrey, the site of the Brokewood Cemetery. The spread of disease like scarlet fever and other contagious infections made extra graves necessary, and the distance from the city helped keep contamination away from the living. Another chill tangled itself in my hair the closer we drew to the water. I hadn't forgotten the river was one of the places Thomas suggested our murderer had committed his heinous deeds. So why, then, was he stalking that very location this late at night? Before I thought on it too much, a second figure emerged from a sunken access road where carriages delivered corpses to the necropolis under the river. I didn't mind the bodies as much as I feared the living, breathing creatures lurking about but such a place. I had a terrible suspicion this wasn't some secret meeting of the Knights of Whitechapel. Sneaking into an alleyway adjacent to the building, I craned my neck, hoping for a better view of Thomas and his unidentifiable partner. Their conversation was hushed, so I couldn't make out any particulars. It didn't take much to garner the gist of it, however. One simply did not loiter outside a place where hundreds of deceased were ferried by railway to Brookwood Cemetery, especially when one was studying the inner workings of the human body and needed more test subjects than were volunteered. As if he heard my internal admonishment, Thomas abruptly turned in my direction, and I nearly tumbled to the ground. I closed my eyes and imagined a wall erupting around me, willing Thomas to remain blind to my presence should he investigate this alley. I listened hard, but no sounds of pursuit met my ears. Eventually I crept back to the corner. Thomas faced the opposite direction now, deeply immersed in conversation. The necropolis had an ominous aura surrounding it, even with its ornate ironwork gate and chiseled stonework doing their best to bring peace to mourners paying their last respects. Minutes passed, then the two figures disappeared down the access road. Drat! I paced in my spot, caught between wanting to sprint after them and knowing there was no place to hide should I be spotted in that subterranean passage. If I waited, I could be standing here until dawn. There was no telling if Thomas was getting on the railway to travel to the cemetery, or if he was only going into one of the mortuaries or funeral rooms. I'd visited the building on 2 occasions, once when I retrieved a body for Uncle this summer, and once when Mother died. I barely remember her viewing, but recall every detail of the room in which she rested before taking her final train ride to the cemetery. I couldn't bring myself to go with Father and Nathaniel to her grave that horrible morning. On Father's orders, Mr. Thornley had escorted me home, safely tucked beneath his arm, sheltering me from the cruel reality of the world. I stared into the dark, wishing Thomas would materialize and distract me from my memories. I sighed. Oh, fine, I shall go to you then. A leaf crunched behind me. My blood spiked as if a million mortuary needles pricked me at once. I spun on my heel, ready to fly all the way home, then stumbled against the building, my hand covering my heart. Goodness! You scared the devil out of me! Thomas leaned against the wall beside me, getting entirely too close for decency. I didn't dare move. I hardly remembered to breathe with his face mere inches away. He tapped his fingers on the stone, never taking his eyes off mine, his lips quirking up. Well, you terrify me, Wadsworth. Seems we're even. Some of the shock was wearing off, yet my tongue and muscles felt incapable of movement. The way he stole through the night like a thief was unsettling. I wanted to yell at him, scream about how wrong it was to creep up on someone, but could only stare back, breathing hard. There was something thrilling about being caught by his stare in the dark. Squeaks of a carriage carrying a heavy load broke the charged silence, and he watched as it passed the alleyway. Once horse hooves clacked against the cobblestones in the distance, he turned his attention back on me. I hoped you'd make good on your threats of stalking me. His stare drifted over my ensemble. Perhaps the style of your hair has had a positive effect on your brain, beauty, and function. I narrowed my eyes, tucking the fact he'd called me beautiful away for further inspection. How did you know I was here? A devious smile lifted the corners of his mouth. Tell me something, Wadsworth. Why is it you wriggled in your seat when we were in your parlor, though your aunt was upstairs? He moved closer, tentatively trailing a finger down my cheek. Yet you follow me in the dead of night, with no hope of a chaperone to intervene should I try stealing a kiss. He focused on my lips, and I was petrified by my breaths would snap the strays of my corset. In some ways he looked as frightened as I felt, his attention flicking back up to gaze my reaction. He certainly wanted to kiss me. Of that I was positive. I couldn't deny my wanting traitorous heart, either. Didn't your family warn you against sneaking around at night alone? He asked. Dangerous things linger in the dark. Now my heart thudded for an entirely new reason. He leaned in, cupping my face gently before I regained my senses and swatted his hand away. If he wanted to kiss me, he'd have to come up with something a bit more romantic than an alley outside a funeral station. "What are you doing here?" With great effort, he tore his gaze from mine and stepped back. "Securing a body for my personal laboratory. What else would I be doing? Finding a nice girl to court in the necropolis?" I blinked. "Truly, you're thieving a corpse and outright admitting it?" "Who said I was thieving?" Thomas looked at me as if I were the mad one. "This corpse was unclaimed. I have permission to study unclaimed bodies and bring them back." I crossed my arms. "Which is why you're sneaking about at night?" Thomas jerked his chin toward the retreating carriage noise. "I'm here when Oliver's shift ends." He laughed at my confused expression. "Honestly, your imagination is fascinating, Wadsworth. Next you'll be accusing me of the murders." I noticed his gaze drop to my lips and pursed them in response. I've never heard of such an arrangement before. "While it's quite intriguing being holed up in the dark, deserted alleyway with you, arguing about facts," he said, "I have better uses of my time." He paused, taking in my hurt expression. "Allow me to amend that statement. We have better uses of our time. However, if you prefer, we can stay here. I enjoy loitering in darkened places with you fine enough." I couldn't help smiling. He was devilish. "Now then, are you coming? This one's nice and fresh." He rubbed his hands together, hardly able to contain his dark glee. If I were a good girl, I'd go home and pretend I had no inkling of what Thomas was up to. I'd climb into my bed and attend breakfast with my aunt and cousin. We discussed the circus and plan another tea while stitching seams and napkins for our future husbands. But I wasn't like my cousin or aunt. I was not wicked, simply curious. I wanted to study the body as much as Thomas did, even if the acts of human dissection and going home with a boy damned me to a wretched death in society. Half an hour later, we were outside his flat, paying the man who delivered the cadaver. He glared at me before pocketing the money. His eyes were two black holes, void of human emotion. It took my entire concentration, but I managed to hold in my shudder. Thomas motioned me inside, then shut the door. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but a simple foyer and a staircase leading to a flat upstairs wasn't it. "Cozy," I said. A small table was set with a tray of biscuits that smelled as if they'd been freshly baked and laid out within the hour. Thomas nodded toward the food. "Help yourself. Miss Harvey can be quite insufferable when her treats get stale overnight." I wasn't hungry, but didn't want to offend this mysterious biscuit-making woman he kept hidden God only knew where. We reached the door to his flat, and Thomas hesitated only slightly before pushing it open. Inside, papers and journals were scattered about in haphazard piles towering 3 feet high. Taxidermy animals lined the shelves around the room, and scientific tools were lying about in disarray. A strong scent of laboratory chemicals lingered in the air. In the far corner stood a portable table with a fresh cadaver on it. I was momentarily speechless, not because of the body, but because of the room itself. How Thomas found anything in this mess was another mystery to figure out. I was getting used to expecting the unexpected when it came to him, but this still managed to pry a bit of shock from me. His person was so neat and clean, and this was not. "Where are your parents?" I asked, noticing a photograph of a pretty dark-haired girl on a shelf. A fist clenched in my chest. Was Thomas promised to someone else? His family was titled, and an early betrothal wasn't out of the ordinary. I didn't care for that thought one bit. I motioned toward the picture. "She is lovely." He turned his back on me and walked toward it. "She is quite lovely," he said, picking up the photograph. "Enchanting, really. Those eyes and perfectly proportioned features. Comes from a magnificent family, too." He sighed happily. "I love her with all my heart." He was in love. How exceptionally wonderful for him. I wished them both a lifetime of misery with ill-mannered children. I swallowed my annoyance down and plastered on a smile. "I hope you'll both be very happy together." Thomas whipped his head around. "Pardon? You—" He studied the set of my jaw and forced indifference of my features. The scoundrel had the audacity to laugh. "She's lovely because she's my sister, Audrey Rose. I'm referring to the superior genes we have in common. My heart belongs only to you." I blinked. "You have a sister?" I assume you haven't come here to ask questions about my personal life, or tell me about the circus you attended with your brother this evening." He glanced in my direction, his grin spreading. "Much to my dismay, you've not come here for a clandestine tryst, either." "How did you know about the He cocked his head, taking in the rest of my attire. "Perhaps you'd like to tell me what you learned at the asylum, though." I rounded on him. "How do you know I've been to an asylum?" "The sawdust caught in the folds of your skirts didn't come from time spent at the Olympia. There aren't many places in London a girl would come into contact with said material. I couldn't picture you spending time in a carpentry shop, low-end pub, or morgue this late. So where does that leave us?" He asked without expecting an answer, ticking off each place on his fingers. "Laboratories, workhouses, and asylums. Narrowing that down further, I saw rust stains on the palms of your hands. Most likely you've encountered old bars. Then there's the matter of your torn skirt and the little package you've tucked away." He raised his brows. "It's all right to act impressed. I know I would be." "Oh, get on with it already. Anyway, it didn't take much to conclude you've been to the asylum and have shown up here to discuss your findings," he said. "Another rather obvious conclusion, as I assume you were visiting your uncle." "Show off," I said, subtly rubbing my palms down on my skirt. A memory of hanging on to the bars crossing my mind. I hadn't even realized my hands were stained from such a brief contact. It took every last ounce of energy to prevent myself from rolling my eyes at the smug look on his face. I offered a slow clap. "Well played, Thomas. You figured out the obvious. Good for you. Now then, we need to figure out what Uncle was drugged with, if it's standard asylum tonic or something more sinister." "What do you mean?" he asked. "How was he acting?" I filled Thomas in on the evening's events while pulling out my makeshift satchel of the porridge and testing its contents. It was as if he were lost in some trance. Thomas watched as I smeared the substance on litmus paper. The dropper is in the top drawer under a stack of papers on the left. I followed his instructions and found it easily. I put a drop of liquid onto the paper and watched it turn deep blue. It's definitely an opiate of some sort. "They're probably giving it to him in near pure form," he said, pacing in front of the desk. "If they're really moving his trial so quickly, they'll want him as mad-looking as possible. Most elixirs cause hallucinations, which explains his state. Unfortunately, that's not all that uncommon. Could be standard pre-trial procedure." He stopped only long enough to glance at me. "You're positive Blackburn can be trusted. What do you know of him?" I knew the policeman from only a few unpleasant encounters and wasn't positive about anything. "I think he feels guilty Uncle's in this mess, and I believe he's trying to make up for arresting him by involving me in the case." "Feeling guilt does not make for a solid basis of trust. If anything, it makes me trust him less." He narrowed his eyes, stalking over to me. "Why has he shown such an interest in your family? If you weren't so taken with him, you'd be more skeptical of his motives. A lot can be hidden beneath a boyish grin." "I am not taken with anyone." "We agreed we wouldn't lie to one another," he said quietly, then turned away before I could read the expression on his face. "Someone's keen on having your uncle swing for these crimes," Audrey rose. "Let's assume the worst about Blackburn. Everyone must remain a suspect until proven otherwise." "Should I be wary of even you, Mr. Cresswell?" Thomas stood before me, all traces of humor gone from his expression. "Yes. It would behoove you to stay on alert at all times, even with respect to those closest to you." And I thought I was an alarmist. Thomas walked over to a cabinet, pulling out 2 white aprons from within. I pushed the chemistry set aside, thinking wretched things. If there's another murder between now and the 30th, they'll have to set him free, won't they? I picked at a thread on my bodice, not wanting to look up. I mean, surely they wouldn't try him for these crimes if another one occurred while he was in the asylum. Thomas's attention snagged onto mine. "Are you suggesting we stage a murder, Wadsworth? Are you planning on doing the slashing, or should I handle that part?" "Don't be ridiculous. I only mean that there's always a possibility another body will turn up. I can't believe our murderer will simply give up and quietly fade into the night. You've said so yourself." Thomas considered this for a few moments. "I suppose. But if we're betting on that theory, then it's also possible I'll invent a sky-traveling steamship before the week's out." "Are you even trying to build a flying steamship?" "Absolutely not." he said with an impish grin, grabbing a scalpel from the examination table and handing it to me along with an apron. "You said it yourself. Anything's possible." He nodded toward the subject. "Let's get on with this. We've got to return the body by dawn, and I'd like to harvest the gallbladder first." Without hesitation, I split the skin wide with my blade, earning an appreciative whistle from Thomas. Chapter 19. Dear Boss, Central News Agency, London, 27 September 1888. The sound of typewriters clicking away to the beat of 100 fingers greeted Thomas and me as we followed Superintendent Blackburn into the busy news agency. Most all of their stories were sensationalized lies and slander charges waiting to happen. According to my brother, I didn't disagree. Blackburn had found me locked away in Uncle's laboratory, poring over murder details and evidence being used against Uncle, and insisted I see the latest horror for myself. Blackburn wasn't eager for Thomas's company, but I convinced him his expertise was very much needed. Thomas would likely spot any detail overlooked, and that's precisely what Uncle needed. Blackburn eventually gave in. Liza had assisted in fabricating excuses to leave the house, telling her mother we were in desperate need of shopping excursions. Aunt Amelia was thrilled to have me doing appropriate girl things, and sent us out, humming to herself. I suspected my cousin was willing to help me because it afforded her time to sneak away to the park with her newest love interest. Regardless of her motives, I was grateful for her presence and would miss her when they returned to the country. Anxiety twisted through my limbs. Blackburn wasn't a man of many words, so he didn't spare much on the carriage ride over. All I knew was something came up that could potentially raise doubts about Uncle's guilt or set the noose around his neck for good. Thomas might not trust Blackburn, but I was desperate enough to take any assistance we could get, even if it meant following the person who'd originally put my uncle in the asylum to the depths of hell. We walked by several desks with reporters writing and excitedly chatting over the day's news. A palpable buzz could be felt like electricity running through Edison bulbs. At the end of the small room stood an office with a stout man seated behind an even larger desk. He was wearing spectacles on his face and stress in his bones. The etching on the door informed anyone who entered he was the editor. There was a bleak look about him that permeated his every movement and action. It spoke of seeing too much of life's darkness. His attention landed on each of us, seemingly calculating our motives or personalities before settling on Superintendent Blackburn. He dabbed a cigarette out with pudgy fingers, then motioned for us to step inside and have a seat, his movements quick and jittery. I watched the tiny embers fade from orange to gray ash that lifted in the wake of our entrance. A thick cloud of smoke took up residence above our heads, as if not wanting to miss out on what we were about to learn. I couldn't find the will to be annoyed by the toxic fumes. I was too nervous about the news that might exonerate or further condemn Uncle. Thomas, however, appeared ready to jump over the desk and suck the last dregs of tobacco into his lungs. With unsteady hands, the editor pointed toward the tea set on a buffet near the wall. "If any of you would like a refreshment before we begin, please help yourself." Blackburn looked at me, brows raised, and I gave a slight shake of my head. I didn't want to stay longer than necessary. This place was overwhelming, and the editor made me nervous. "No, thank you, Mr. Doyle," he said. "If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to see the letter you spoke of earlier." "What you're about to see is rather unpleasant," Mr. Doyle warned, staring at me in particular, "especially for a young lady." I smiled, leaning over the desk, and used the sweetest tone I could muster. In my spare time I flay open bodies of the deceased, 2 of whom were victims of leather apron. The scent that hung in the room would drop a man to his knees, and I aided my uncle during the post-mortems while standing in gelled blood. I sat back in my chair, the leather squeaking its own disapproval. "Whatever you have to show us won't be too much for my stomach to handle, I assure you." Mr. Doyle blanched, then nodded curtly, shuffling papers lying in front of him. It was hard to tell if he was more disturbed by my unladylike activities or by the way I delivered the message in such a girlish tone. Either way, I felt mildly redeemed for having turned the tables of discomfort around on him. Thomas snorted, then held his hands up in a gesture of apology when Mr. Doyle glared at him. Blackburn, dropping his air of station, looked as boyish as Thomas and was doing only a slightly better job of hiding his amusement. I studied this version of Blackburn. Thomas was right. There was something disarming about his features. With one shy glance, he earned your trust completely. Okay, so that was the end of page 191. So we can open a gift now. Yay! So let me put a bookmark and then we will continue reading. Gift, gift, gift. 192, page 191. Here it is. Oh, I can't reach it. I have to go down and reach it. Here we go. It's in a cute little round box. Look how cute, guys. Ta-da! It says open on page 191. Oh, that's so cute. Oh, my mom is so perfect. So there's a little teacup and saucer because they were talking about tea. And because they offered tea. And there's Earl Grey. Oh, there's something else in here. Oh my god, that's so cute. It's a tiny teapot. And little tiny cup. And little tiny saucers. There are 2 of each. Oh, that is just too cute. Ugh, my mom and dad are wonderful. So, we've got a little cup and saucer, a little thing of tea. Don't mind if I do. Delicious. Those are so cute. Cute. So cute. Okay, we will continue. Mr. Doyle cleared his throat. Very well, then. He opened the top drawer of his desk, removed a letter, then slid it across to where we were sitting in straight-back chairs. He seemed anxious to be rid of us already. I had half a mind to inform him the feeling was very mutual. This came in the post this morning. Thomas snatched it before Blackburn or I could and read aloud. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. Thomas opened his mouth, no doubt ready to say something Thomas-like, so I used the distraction against him, grabbing the letter from his clutches and reading it for myself. The grammar was atrocious. I read the shaky, loopy script quickly, my skin crawling over my bones with each sentence my gaze touched. The ink was blood red, likely to instill fear in the recipient, as if the message inside wouldn't be frightening enough. For all I knew, perhaps it was written in blood. Nothing would surprise me when it came to this madman. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. Slow can they catch me now. I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the people red I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The something job. The west job I do. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you? Just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away, if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it, no luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. Sorry for how rough that was to read, but it's like super scrolly, scripty writing. It is really kind of hard to read. Plus the grammar was definitely atrocious. Audrey was quite right. So I stumbled with that a little bit. Sorry about that. Setting the letter down, my thoughts swirled together in a maelstrom of hope and dread. While there was no guarantee this alone could save Uncle, it certainly might help. Thomas and Blackburn took turns reading the letter, then sat back in their chairs. No one said a thing for an eternity until Thomas spoke up. What joke about Leather Apron? I don't recall police saying anything humorous about it, unless he knows something we don't. Editor Doyle and Thomas both stared at Blackburn, waiting for his response, but Blackburn only sighed and dragged a hand down his exhausted face. Handsome or not, he didn't look as if he'd been sleeping that well since the last time I'd seen him. I haven't the slightest clue about what the author of this letter is referring to. Perhaps he's talking about the headlines calling him Leather Apron. I cleared my throat and looked at Mr. Doyle. The author of this letter said not to show it around for a few days. Why ring Superintendent Blackburn? Mr. Doyle turned his world-weary gaze on me. Even if this letter proves false, sent from some deranged citizen, I could not in good conscience keep it to myself. He swallowed a gulp of tea, then removed a flask from his person and unapologetically took a swig. I'm holding off printing it, but should he follow through with his threats, I wanted my mind free of guilt. A haunted feeling suddenly clung to me. Something strange was going on aside from the editor's seemingly remorseful outreach. Something out of place that I couldn't quite touch on. Then it occurred to me. Thomas Cresswell was unusually quiet. This would normally be the part where he had plenty to say or argue over. He brought the letter close to his face and sniffed. I hadn't the slightest inkling how he'd be able to deduce anything from scent, but knew better than to claim it impossible. The word did not apply to him in any form. I assume this was delivered in an envelope, he said, not bothering to look up from his inspection of the letter. I'll need to see that immediately. Mr. Doyle tossed a glance Blackburn's way, seeking him to jump in and say it wouldn't be necessary, but Blackburn made an impatient gesture with his hand. You heard the young man, Doyle. Hand over any evidence he requests. With a deep scowl settling into place, the editor did as he was asked. He didn't seem like the kind of man who appreciated bending to children's needs. Considering Blackburn himself wasn't much older than my brother, I was certain Mr. Doyle was questioning why he'd involved police at all. Thomas studied every angle of the envelope twice before handing it over to me, his expression carefully composed. Any of this appear familiar to you, Wadsworth? Taking the envelope from him, I silently read it. There was no return address, and the only thing written across it was, The Boss, Central News Office, London City. In the same taunting red ink the letter was drafted in. The very idea it would be at all something I'd seen before was absurd. Then a thought slapped me in the face. Did he think I'd written it in hopes of aiding Uncle? Was that what he thought of me then? I was some spoiled girl walking about London streets doing whatever I pleased without regard to anyone? Was my position as a lord's daughter showing itself in my abuse of privilege? I thrust it back at him. Afraid not, Cresswell. I've never seen this before in my life. If I was expecting some sort of response by using his surname, I was sorely disappointed. He didn't so much as bat one of his long lashes at me. He studied me for another breath, then nodded. Right then, my mistake, Audrey Rose. Mistake? Blackburn glanced between us, a crease forming in his brow. If rumors are to be believed, since when does Dr. Jonathan Wadsworth, protégé, make mistakes? Seems there's a first time for everything, Superintendent, Thomas replied coolly, his attention finally drifting away from me. Though, as someone with a bit more practice being wrong, I'm sure you can empathize. Tell me, what's it like being... I rested my hand on his arm and forced myself to giggle uncontrollably, garnering strange looks from each male in the room, except Thomas, who fixed his attention on the hand still touching him. Blasted Thomas. Was I always to rescue him from himself? Blackburn was an untrustworthy annoyance, but he'd proven useful for once. I wasn't in the mood for Thomas to make an enemy of him today, especially when Uncle's life was potentially at stake. I held my hand up. I do apologize. Thomas has a wicked sense of humor, don't you, Mr. Cresswell? Thomas stared for a beat, then let out a long, annoyed breath. I admit that's a fair assessment, though poorly deduced as usual, Miss Wadsworth. Unfortunately, your uncle's talent has skipped you entirely. At least you've got an attractive smile. It's not much, but will surely make up for your lacking mental faculties. Well, he amended, his focus straying to Blackburn, at least for some equally dull, that is. I gritted my teeth. Well, that may be true. We really should be on our way. We've got that experiment we need to check on in the laboratory, remember? Actually, you're wrong again, my dear. I was so mad I could scream some of the worst obscenities I'd heard at the docks at him. He was ruining our exit strategy, and I was most certainly not his dear. When I thought all hope was lost, Thomas checked his watch. We should have left precisely 3 minutes and 23 seconds ago. If we don't run now, our experiment will be destroyed. Best if we hail a carriage. He turned to the editor and superintendent. It's been as pleasant as a fast day in Lent, gentlemen. By the time they'd figured out his parting was, in fact, an insult, we were already rushing out through the bustling newsroom and exiting onto the cool afternoon streets. We didn't stop walking for a few streets, silence our only companion. Finally, once we'd made a good enough distance to not be spotted by Blackburn, we stopped. What is the meaning of that question? I demanded, anger swelling back up inside me. I could not believe he really thought so little of me. So much for telling each other the truth no matter what. I was not insinuating you had anything to do with writing the letter, Wadsworth, he said. Truly, you must harness those blasted emotions of yours. They'll just get in the way of our investigation. I did not feel like having this conversation again. He might be able to act machine-like during our horrid investigations, but ice and stone were not the material forming my blood and bones. Then what exactly were you insinuating? Someone who was wearing Hasunohana 2 nights ago was in close proximity of that letter. I closed my eyes. You can't be serious, Thomas. That's your major discovery? You think you can identify our murderer by a perfume scent? How can you be sure someone working in the General Post wasn't wearing it? I tossed my hands in the air. Perhaps the letter carrier had it next to another letter written by someone's secret lover. Maybe they spritzed their envelope in their beloved's favorite scent. Did you ever stop to think of that, Mr. I Know Everything? You were wearing the very same fragrance 2 nights ago, he replied softly, staring at the ground, all hints of arrogance gone. The night you visited the asylum and followed me to the necropolis, I smelled it on you in the alleyway. I went to several shops trying to find the exact scent. He looked at his hands. I wanted to purchase it for you. If he'd reached out and slapped me, I would have been less shocked. This was what my only true friend in the world thought of me. I was a monster waiting to be unleashed. Maybe he was right. I certainly didn't feel like crying or begging for him to believe me. I didn't even feel good about his admission of wanting to buy a gift for me. I felt like drawing blood, his blood in particular. So you are suggesting I had something to do with this? I half yelled, walking away before turning back. He still wouldn't meet my glare. How dare you? How dare you think such reprehensible things of me? It's the most popular scent in London. For your blasted information, both my aunt and cousin were wearing the very same fragrance. Are you implying one of them wrote the letter? Would your aunt try to protect Dr. Wadsworth, or perhaps your family's reputation? He took a deep breath. She's very religious, is she not? I cannot! I shook my head. This is absurd. I was through with him. If he thought I, or my aunt, or my cousin mailed the letter, so be it. A new, twisted thought made me smile. Jack the Ripper had done me a favor. His letter, whatever the motive, cast a glimmer of hope for Uncle. At least he had a fighting chance now. You know what? You were with me that night, too, Thomas. Perhaps my magic perfume wafted over all your belongings. I wouldn't be surprised if you wrote the bloody letter yourself. I turned on my heel, a springy bounce in my step, and hailed a carriage, leaving Thomas all alone with his accusations and incredulous stares, blissfully unaware of the horror about to take place in the next nights. Okay, that was the end of Chapter 19. We will pick up on Chapter 20 in the next video. Okay, so I hope you guys are still enjoying it. Let me know in the comments below if you've already subscribed. Thanks. If you haven't, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Okay, until next time, Reading by Ree. Bye.